Hello, 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 and welcome to another episode of Not D&D, which is brought to you by EM World Live, which is part of EM World, the leading tabletop news and review site. I almost tripped over my words there as your host, Jessica, because I'm very excited to have our guest with us this week of Mars Diaz-Truman from Magpie Games. Mark, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, great to be here. Thanks.
I'm so excited to have you on because for Magpie Games, lots of people will have heard of the games you do. So we've got Avatar Legends, we've got Root, we've got Bluebeard's Bride. So we've got all sorts of fantastic games people may have heard of. And this week we're going to focus on talking about Urban Shadows as well, the second edition that's coming out. So the main part of the talk we're going to have is about that. So if you're watching live, please put your questions in the comments and we'll try and answer them if we have the answers to those questions. And if you're listening to the podcast, any links to what we're talking about will be in the show notes. So Mark, I'd love to hear a little bit about you and your background with role-playing games. Obviously, very impressive catalogue of games you've worked on. But the question I always ask people is, what was the first game that you remember playing?
Oh my god, the first game I remember playing. I mean, it's probably D&D. Like, I think
Classic.
I think there's like probably I'm like 10 years too old to have had something more interesting be my first game. But I remember playing D&D with like my Boy Scout troop when we were like 12. We'd like all sleep
Wow.
over at each other's houses, and our parents were probably happy we weren't like out doing drugs and lighting things on fire. So they were happy that we were up all night drinking Mountain Dew and playing D&D.
Yeah, we know where they are. They're safe. They're playing some sort of board game, I think. I don't really know.
Exactly. Yeah. We'd come home all bleary eyed and like we didn't sleep all night, and they were happy to have us sleep for the rest of the day. That's fine. No problem.
Amazing. That's perfect. Well, yeah, any parents out there watching now might be like, hey, I need to get my kid into role-playing games for sure. It
Exactly.
sounds like a great tactic. So started with D&D as was because it was the big thing at the time, but obviously the industry has grown and got so much more diverse.
Yeah.
When did you start kind of exploring indie different games or when did you start like designing games?
Yeah, I
For
mean, so the irony is when you asked about what we used to play, I mean, we actually like many kids, I'm probably sure, like we designed some of our own stuff. We're like, what if it was like D&D, but like in the future, right? Or something where we would basically just take D&D and then of course make it in the future without any thought about what might be required for a different kind of story. But no, it was really like I played D&D for most of high school or like middle school, and then in high school I had these older friends in the drama department at Theater Nerds who played
Awesome
World of
people.
Darkness games. And so
Yeah.
like I was like the sophomore that they were okay hanging out with when they were all cool. In my mind, very cool
Yeah,
seniors,
yeah, yeah.
right? And that
Wow.
was where I first got exposed to stuff like Mage and like Vampire and like darker, more adult games. But it wasn't until like years and years later I actually ran a bunch of World of Darkness LARPs where like
Oh
people
yeah.
come and play vampires and stuff, which is great until it turns toxic. Like it's great for the first 3 weeks of any LARP, and then people
All
get
right.
weird out of.
I
Well, it's just like
know.
politics are politics, right? So people play them
Yeah.
out of character and in character. So it can be
Amazing.
really
I
challenging.
have I have heard that about that LARP scene, but I've not experienced it myself. But yeah, I will believe you. Yeah.
Yeah. So like I was kind of fed up with like I don't know, like a lot of nitpicking around the rules, not a lot of thoughtfulness around like what kind of stories are we telling. That's not really the framework that people have when
Mhm.
they LARP, right?
Yeah.
They're telling their part of the story. They're not really
Mhm.
invested in like the bigger story.
Sure.
So a friend of mine, Jess Hennig, who actually wrote for some World of Darkness stuff, like I didn't really
Mhm.
understand at the time that Jess had like he was like the systems lead for like Mage, the Ascension, second edition or whatever. But he was like, you should check out this guy John Wick in his games. And so I played Houses of the Blooded, which is like
Mhm.
probably my first indie game, which is one of John's titles that he did on his own, like after Seventh Sea and his work at
Mhm.
AG. And it had things like which it seems so silly now, but at the time it was like mind blowing to me.
Yeah.
Stats that described your like your beauty and
Yeah.
your like your cleverness, right? Not stats that were like literally just representations of you as a physical being, right?
Mhm.
One of your stats had to be a weakness, meaning like you had a
Mhm.
0 in that stat. If you ever
Yeah.
competed with that stat, you just lost. So it's sort of
Mhm.
like in The Princess Bride, like Vicini can never beat Fezzik in a fight. It doesn't matter how well he rolls.
Mhm.
His strength is 0, but Fezzik's cleverness is 0 too. Like he can never
Yeah.
outsmart Vizini in any circumstance, right?
Mhm.
And this for me, just like as like 25-year-old Mark was just like the most mind blow. Like I was like, I didn't know role playing games could do this, right?
Yeah.
And so I just fell down this rabbit hole of just trying all these different Fiasco, right? Or
Mhm.
and then eventually Apocalypse World. I played an Apocalypse World game a year or two after it came out at Gen Con and was like, whoa, like immediately, like, whoa, I don't even know if I like this. Like, what? This is so different. But that whole journey started with House of the Blooded.
Amazing. So, Powered by the Apocalypse brings us on really nicely to Urban Shadows, obviously, which is kind of using that sort of system. If people haven't heard, this is the second edition we're going to be talking about, but
Yeah.
if people haven't heard of Urban Shadows at all, how would you introduce them to this game?
Yeah, so Urban Shadows is ironically, because we're talking World of Darkness, it's kind of my love letter to every urban fantasy game
Mm-hmm.
you've ever played as a role player.
Mm-hmm.
And unlike a lot of other urban fantasy games, it's one in which you can play sort of any different type of creature. Not all vampires or all werewolves or whatever. It's
Mm-hmm.
really about a city filled with different factions, different viewpoints and communities that kind of come into conflict with each other. So
Sure.
you might be from the faction of knights, like the vampires and the werewolves, who care about
Mm-hmm.
like blood and money and sex and drugs and territory, so like really rooted in like the here and now. Or
Mm-hmm.
you might be from power, like the wizards and the oracles, who kind of see the world through the lens of how it will be shaped over decades and centuries, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or you might be from wild, who are like the faeries and the demons, like they're from outside this reality and they've come here and they have one foot here and one foot in this other place. Or you might be Mortalis, which is the faction of people who they're like caught between worlds. Like they're the
Mm-hmm.
hunters, the people who like make money selling supernatural objects back in the
Sure.
mortal world.
Mm-hmm.
And so because of that, it's not a game in which you're kind of all on the same team. It's a game
Mm-hmm.
more like The Wire, where like your stories kind of intersect and connect as you explore your character's perspective on that power struggle.
Amazing. Someone in the chat said it reminds them a bit of like Dresdenish, so that seems
For sure.
very the vibe. Yeah,
Yeah. Dresden, American Gods, very much those kinds of. It's not Underworld. It's not like everybody's wearing leather and shoot. I mean, I guess you could play it that way if
you
you want,
could.
but
Yeah.
but like the main driver of the game is this
hmm
mechanic called debt, in which
hmm
case you owe people and they owe you. And in
Okay.
this game, when you actually say, "Hey, Jessica, I did you a real solid the other day when I got your brother off your case. I
hmm
need you to do this for me." That's actually a game mechanic in which your character is
Okay.
pressured to kind of play along because you owe, right? And that whole sense of owing people and them owing you is like the foundational currency of a world in which, I don't know, wizards can just make money from nothing. So the only thing that
Yeah.
matters is who you owe and who owes you.
Amazing. So that's kind of like the setting, but let's get into the mechanics a little bit because you kind of
Sure.
talked about that. So it's quite, from what I understand, it's quite like simple mechanics. It's not going to take you, if you've not played it before, it's not going to take you hours to learn what's going on. So it's, from my understanding, it's kind of a 2d6 system, and
Right.
then you have your stats that kind of affect the outcome of that roll. Is
Yeah,
that
yeah, yeah.
about? Yeah.
Yeah,
hmm
totally. You have 4 stats in the game:
hmm
blood, heart, mind, and spirit. So pretty
hmm
straightforward. Each one of them describes, not like blood is not like your physical, everything about you physically in one stat. It's more your position in the fiction, right? So a high
hmm
blood character is somebody who can use violence and crash through walls and do cool things, but
hmm
like, I don't know, like The Rock in Fast and the Furious, right? He's just like
Sure.
it's impossible to stop, right? But somebody who's high mind is
hmm
tricky and can see things others can't see. And Dresden is probably a high mind character, right? He's
hmm
able to like kind of piece together evidence and figure out what's going on. Um,
hmm
but he might also be a high spirit character, because spirit
hmm
influences like your supernatural abilities, your ability to keep cool under pressure, right? So you have these stats that are designed not to like literally say, oh, I'm 7 points strong or 8 points strong, but to
Sure. Yeah.
instead give you a position when you roll the dice.
hmm
Either that position is strong, like I have a +2, a +3,
hmm
or it's weak, I have a -1, -2, right? And those,
hmm
when you roll the dice, the relationship is a little different. You're rolling
hmm
2d6, like you said, um,
hmm
but you're doing so to do a move. And a move is
hmm
not like a skill check. A move is a bit of narrative, like uncertainty. So the
hmm
most simple one is when you turn to violence, you roll with blood.
hmm
And what happens is that when you roll, if you get a 7 or higher, that's called a hit.
hmm
So if you're rolling with a +3, you can tell like 2d6 +3, all you got to do is get to a 7. That's like no problem, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah,
if you're rolling with a -2, it's like, oh, that's like really hard to get to a 7. But a
yeah. hmm
7 is a hit, and that means that you kind of get some of what you want. But you might not
hmm
get all of what you want. You might have to make some choices or have some compromises. If it's under a 7, if it's a 6 or less, it's a miss, not a
hmm
failure. A miss means that I, the GM, or whoever's the GM, will tell you what
Mm-hmm.
happens. So, for example, you can say, okay, this werewolf's coming towards me. Great. I pull out my machine gun and I just like spray bullets at him. And I'm like, great, cool, roll. And you just roll snake eyes. I'm like, yeah, sorry. Even though you have a +3, this is only a 5. So it's a miss. And I'll say, like, you shoot the werewolf, like your bullets just rip through him. Like you're so cool, right? Like, you know how to shoot a gun. I'm not going to take that away from you. But as the
Mm-hmm.
werewolf stumbles and falls over, you realize as he shifts back into a human form, that's your brother. Like, you didn't know that it was your brother until this moment, but the miss means that the story is going to twist and turn in interesting
Mm-hmm.
ways, which means there's really two things that happen in the game. Either the narrative moves forward because
Yeah.
you chose to move it forward, or it twists and turns because the GM finds an interesting thing to play up and go with in that moment.
That's so interesting. I love that. The only thing about this system, I'm kind of new to. I've been role playing for like 15 years, but new to GMing. I'm that awful person everyone hates that's
No,
never the
that's great.
GM.
Congrats.
But
Welcome. Thank you. That's so
I know I'm
exciting.
trying. But
That's great.
like the only thing about these kind of systems for me, sometimes, what advice do you give to GMs for creating those twists and turns in a story?
Yeah.
Because a lot of it's on the fly and being reactive, which can seem kind of intimidating.
Sure. So the first thing is like, Urban Shadows 1, one of the reasons we did a new edition is because we've learned a lot about building these games, and I had a lot of
Mm-hmm.
new ideas we wanted to bring to it. But I'll tell you, one of the pieces that I think is really strong about Urban Shadows in general
Mm-hmm.
is that it has a very detailed and inclusive GM chapter. So like the
Amazing.
whole GM chapter is not this kind of like, just do a good job, be interesting, write a good story, do
Yeah.
voices. Like, it's instead like, okay, let's talk about what
Mm-hmm.
your goals are here. And those
Mm-hmm.
goals can be kind of broken down into some rules you should follow. So, for example, one of the rules you should follow as a GM when you do Urban Shadows, not every game, but Urban Shadows,
Mm-hmm.
is to be a fan of the player's characters, which means that
Sure.
one of your rules should be never just embarrass them to embarrass them. Always
Mm-hmm.
give them stuff that makes you feel like they're the main character on a TV show you love, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
you want to see that, but you want to see, like, I always think about John Wick, right? Like the movie, right? Like,
Yeah.
I want to see John kill people. So
Mm-hmm.
I need him to be in a bad spot. Like, being a fan
Mm-hmm.
of John Wick is not just giving John a nice life and with nothing bad happens. Like,
Sure.
I have to make him miserable, but like, he wants to, like, the
Yeah.
character like, that's the whole, like, so being a fan is
Yeah.
not simple, but it's an orienting principle that will tell you, if the
Mm-hmm.
werewolf just grabs the hunter, say it's the hunter that's playing with us, and throws
Sure.
them into a wall, and you're like, yep, he totally gets you. It's like, is that really being a fan of the hunter? But what if the werewolf grabs the hunter, slams him up against the wall, and like, you like, oh, like, venom is dripping from his mouth, and you're like, what do you do, hunter? Now the hunter's like, oh man, yeah, like, this is my moment, right? That's what you
Mm-hmm.
want to give them. And we break that down into moves for the GM too. So, for
Okay.
example, you might have a move like put someone in a spot, or inflict harm, or claim a debt. So you might say, for example, what if somebody else steps out and deals with the werewolf for you, but now you owe that person because they saved your life?
Oh yeah.
So
Okay.
you as a GM can look down your menu of moves, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not like you hit a button and it goes. You still have to like
Sure.
do it,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? But if you're ever stuck, you're like, fuck, I don't know what to do. And you're like, oh, hey, look, turn your players' weaknesses back against them. Cool. Like, I'm gonna do this thing about the mortal being human. I'm gonna like break his
Mm-hmm.
leg or something. And now it's like, hey, you're
Yeah.
not a werewolf, right? You're not a vampire. You're an
Mm-hmm.
ordinary guy. What do you do? And the like, maybe the player will love that because
Yeah.
it's a reminder that it's like a reaffirmation of their character. Like, I see you, I'm reinforcing your character, I'm being a fan of you as a player and
Yeah.
as a character. Does that make sense? Is that helpful?
Yeah, no, that's really good advice. Thank you. So, yeah, so it's good to know that there's that guidance for GMs in the books as well. So that's there for people like me. But talking a little bit about players. So maybe you convinced your GM to run this for you, and you're going to
Yeah.
kind of be a player in this. What sort of characters are you going to be playing? So we've kind of talked a bit about the world, and you've got your 4 stats, but if we could talk about how do you create a character and the archetypes that you give.
Yeah, so the way that a lot of Powered by the Apocalypse games work, and it's not all of them, right? Like not
Mhm.
every Powered by the Apocalypse game has dice. We actually sell some that don't use dice; they use tokens. Not every Powered
Sure.
by the Apocalypse game has playbooks, but this one does. And a playbook is
Mhm.
sort of like an archetype with a story attached to it. So it's not just like a class. It's not like, oh, you're a fighter. It's like you are the hunter, right? And as the
Mhm.
hunter, you're a mortal who's taken on this obligation to protect other mortals from the supernatural world. And
Sure.
as a result of that, you're going to make some choices about who you're protecting people from. Is it
Mhm.
vampires? Is it evil wizards? Is it angels? Like one of the choices on the playbook is angels,
Okay.
right? So it's not
Okay.
just leaving you, Jessica, like, Jessica, think of something really cool, like really, really cool,
Mhm.
like no pressure. Just like really, really cool thing for you to be hunting. You get to look down the list and be like, oh man,
Mhm.
angels, that's fucking odd. Let's do that. And then you and I, as your GM and player, would build
Mhm.
on that answer. Be like, why do you hunt angels? What is that about? Like, is your family, is that something for your family? Where's that come from? And we
Mhm.
would build out together, almost like a tree sprouting from that seed, a
Mhm.
whole bunch of cool fiction that would then inform our game, right?
Yeah.
But the secret sauce of playbooks is that they're actually kind of like they're pointed in a certain direction. So the hunter, for
Mhm.
example, they're not well. Anybody who decides to basically be Batman is like not probably in their right mind, right?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
So what happens is that the hunter's kind of locked in this struggle where like they're good at
Mhm.
violence, but maybe violence doesn't solve that many problems. And so
Mhm.
over the arc of your character, you're going to have to decide as the hunter how you're going to deal with that violence.
Mhm.
Sometimes that's in really obvious ways, like I've given you a bunch of violence moves, and then the MC is going to complicate what happens when you do violence. But sometimes it's really subtle, like all playbooks have ways to
Mhm.
advance, like maybe you get a new move or you get a new ability or you get a new stat bonus or whatever. One
Mhm.
of the advancements you can take in the game is to retire to safety. It's basically to
Mhm.
say, I think I'm done with this character. Like I would like
Sure.
to retire, and I don't want my character to have to die to have the story be
Mhm.
done. So you retire to safety. The
Mhm.
hunter cannot do that. It's not an option for them, which means the hunter's story is at some level about whether they change and decide to become a new playbook, a new, like take a new
Mhm.
path in their life, or die. These are the two options that they
Is
have,
yeah.
right? And so playbooks are interesting in that they're like little arrows that are sort of drawn back and fired in a direction. But
Mhm.
because we have tables of 4 or 5 people, they're not, no two hunters will ever be the same because they're going to be
Sure.
pulled in different directions by the wizard and
Mhm.
the vampire and the fairy that are all at the same table doing their own thing and pulling in their own direction.
Amazing. That sounds so cool. I mean, I know a lot of people that are familiar with Urban Shadows that kind of the first edition are looking for the second edition because you have two kind of brand new playbooks of the Sworn and the Imp. Could you talk a little bit about those?
Oh my god, yes, I was so excited about like like one of the things that like I really, so sorry, you made me really excited, so I lost my train of thought for a
I
second.
love
So
it. I love
uh,
the excitement.
good,
Yes.
good, good. So part of the whole secret of Urban Shadows is like, we talk about like we get to draw on a much broader set of
Hmm.
influences than say like a regular urban fantasy game because
Sure.
we're not just talking about vampires. Like
Hmm.
The Wire is a big influence, as is John Wick,
Yeah.
right? Like these are two things I
Hmm.
mentioned because they kind of
Yeah.
get at like cities and people who live in cities and how they
Yes.
come into conflict
Yeah.
with each other. So one of the things that really bummed me out about first edition as we played it
Hmm.
and did more things with it is that like there's nobody who's having to struggle with being like an enforcer or like a cop
Hmm.
in some ways, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so if you watch a movie like Training Day, right, you have these
Hmm.
like this idea of like being a cop means filling a particular role in the ecosystem of a city, right?
Sure.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
so the Sworn is, I mean, they're kind of a wizard cop. Like they've sworn an
Cool.
allegiance to a very powerful faction of
Hmm.
wizards, or someone like wizards, oracles, immortals, whatever, and their job is to be the agent of that faction in the
Right.
world, right?
Okay.
And they've been given like a truly like a weapon, a legendary weapon, like
Hmm.
Excalibur or
Okay.
Thor's hammer or
Okay.
like something really really amazing,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
tied to them following the rules of this faction, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And this is a playbook like I don't think I would have been able to write like before. Like I think the idea was there, but
Okay.
we couldn't figure out
Yeah. Yeah.
how to manage it.
Hmm.
But it ends up being a really interesting way of watching people sort of contend with their obligations. Like
Hmm.
what are you willing to do for these people you've sworn an oath to? What if you don't even
Hmm.
like them? How far are you willing to go? And
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
the hunter, there's some stuff around advancement where
Hmm.
as the sworn breaks the rules, it becomes easier to break the rules. And so you're sort of
Right.
tempted to like,
Mm-hmm.
once you've gone rogue, like
Become a dirty cop type
that's
thing.
right.
Yeah.
Or maybe you're like, maybe you don't believe in the system anymore, and it's your job to like, go do what's right
Yeah.
instead of what you're being asked to do by the people who run the city. Right? The imp
Mm-hmm.
is the same. I'm always bummed that we didn't have sort of the immigrant business owner playbook, like someone who like has
Mm-hmm.
come to the city to make a better life for themselves, and they found some way to like anchor themselves here. So like Lauren
Mm-hmm.
from Angel, right, is a great example,
Yeah.
or Papa Midnight from Constantine, right? Like these people who
Yeah.
they fill a role in the community, and the imp
Mm-hmm.
lets us do that. Like gives us the space, and we actually had some really interesting discussions. We originally announced the imp as the goblin because
Mm-hmm.
that's often like goblin markets and stuff like that.
Sure.
But one of the challenges of developing Urban Shadows is that there's a lot of stuff like race and gender and stuff
Mm-hmm.
baked in, and goblins can be a really anti-Semitic archetype. And so we
Sure.
actually
Yeah.
worked with some Jewish designers that I've worked with before, and we sort of had a meeting and talked like, is there any way for us to make this work? Like it's a really unfortunate stereotype. Can we kind of redeem it? Like for example, for me
Mm-hmm.
as a Latino, werewolves are often kind of cast as people of color, like
Mm-hmm.
like Jacob in Twilight, right? Like
Yeah.
Edward's white.
That was yeah. Yeah.
Right. So like he's kind of swarthy and dark and like tribal, right? And
Yeah.
yet at the
Yeah.
same time, I fucking love werewolves. So like I'm kind of torn, if that makes sense,
Yeah. Yeah.
between
Yeah.
like Jacob's kind of cool. So like what do
Mm-hmm.
I do with that feeling? I was like, well, maybe we
Mm-hmm.
can kind of do that with the goblin. But the more we talked about it, we're like, this is just really loaded. And so we
Mm-hmm.
sat down and said, well, what else could we do instead? And what we came up with was this idea that you're a demon, like Lauren from Angel, who's kind
Oh
of
yeah.
gotten out of your service. You found a
Mm-hmm.
way to like a loophole in your contract. And now you
Sure.
own this bar or run this business. And as long as you run it, your loophole is intact, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it took us to some of the same spaces where we have this person who's not from here, who
Mm-hmm.
has a business that like means everything to them, but
Yeah.
isn't sort of caught up in some of the stereotypes that we'd like to be able to protect players. They don't have to like I'm playing
Yeah.
a goblin, but like not a stereotype. Like they get to play a demon in a really
Mm-hmm.
exciting way.
That's really cool. I love that. I love that about it. So they're two brand new playbooks for second edition, which is so great to hear. Another new thing I wanted to talk about is you talk a bit when I was doing my research on it is the city is its own character, and you've introduced city hubs in the second edition. Um, Tell us about city hubs, please.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things we found in first edition that could happen is that if players created characters who were like kind of too far away from each other, that they would
Mhm.
have really interesting stories, but they wouldn't actually spend that much time together. So if you
Sure.
watch The Wire, you know that Mayor Carcetti and I don't know, like one of the cops or like
Mhm.
one of the corner boys, right? Like or Stringer, right? Like one of the major drug dealers. Like
Right.
these two characters are like huge anchor points for the story. Like so much revolves around them,
Mhm.
but they never talk. They never come into
Mhm.
conflict with each other. They never actually share any screen time. And if they do, it's like an ironic, like they run into each other at the movie theater and neither one of them really knows who the other is, right?
Yeah. Sure.
So what we wanted to do was ask, well, what is it about some games that bring people into contact with each other over and over, and what
Mhm.
is it about some games that lets people kind of wander off into the darkness? So
Mhm.
what we came up with is this idea called a holding environment, which if you look at something like Masks, which is our teen superhero game,
Sure.
y'all have to be on the same team, which means that when my character and your character get in a big fight and I storm off, like
Mhm.
I'm gonna come back, right? Like Robin and Superboy can have a big fight, but eventually Robin's gonna come back and say he's sorry, right?
Sure.
And that anchor point of like this bubble that everybody rolls around in and bounces around in is really important, right? And for
Mhm.
something like D&D, it can be that we've all agreed to
Mhm.
play on the same team, right? So the paladin
Sure.
and the thief can yell at each other, but they don't know it's all kind of for fun. But the
Yeah.
problem with Urban Shadows is it's not for fun. Like,
Yeah. It's serious.
right?
Yeah.
Like the
Yeah.
vampire and the werewolf
Yeah.
are at odds with you. Like they really are at odds. Like the vampire murdered the werewolf's sister, and yet somehow they have to work together.
Yeah.
But like how do we so what we realized is that we need a slightly tighter holding environment, and that means
Right.
kind of reducing the city, which is just a little bit too big, down
Mhm.
to one district or arena or area, and making sure that all the characters have lots of reasons to be there. It doesn't mean
Okay.
that's the only place the game happens. It's just that's the
Hmm.
anchor point.
Yeah.
So if we're doing like say the arts district, right? Like the
Yeah.
fairies, like great, I own a gallery, done, cool. And the wizards, like, oh, I don't really want to live in the arts district, but how about I come here all the time because I buy magical spell ingredients from this shop that's here in this part of town. And
Right, right.
now the fairy and the wizard can have a relationship that makes sense. They can run into each other all the time. They
Mhm.
can participate with each other. And once you lay that groundwork, then the story can go wherever, because there's
Mhm.
always a reason to come back together because you live or work or play in this neighborhood.
I love that. So yeah, it gives people a reason to kind of be together and things like that. With forming parties and groups, what sort of guidance do you give to players? Like you say, you can have all these different characters that seemingly wouldn't work together. How do you assemble a team to go on to tell the story?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think it's really interesting, right? Because I know that the idea of a party is really central to a lot of role playing, especially like
Sure.
what we might think of as team oriented role playing, right?
Hmm.
So there's the team, the superhero team, there's the
Yeah.
D&D party. So
Hmm.
then people are always like, don't split the party. Like we need to all stay together and like make sure we're here in case the GM springs something on us.
Hmm.
So it's really different to think about a game like Urban Shadows or
Hmm.
Cartel, which is my Mexican narco fiction game. Um,
Hmm.
in which the characters are never on a team. They
Hmm.
maybe have temporary alliances, but it's like instead think about like one of your favorite TV shows in
Hmm.
which it's an ensemble cast, right? And if you
Right.
think about Lost or The Wire or,
Hmm.
Breaking Bad, where the characters are, we know who the central characters are. There's no dispute
Hmm.
that Walter White and Jesse are like the central characters of Breaking Bad. Cool. We
Hmm.
know them. We know that Skylar and her sister are going to be central characters. But what we don't know, and this is why we tune in week after week, is what they're going to do to each other. Like,
Hmm.
not in like a do they murder each other way, although it could get
Maybe.
there. Maybe, right? Could get there. But like we know that your vampire killed my sister, but we have to work together right now because we're both being hunted by the vampire prince who decided to declare a death sentence on both of us. So we
Hmm.
know that we're like we have to work together a little bit, but also like
Hmm.
maybe I could just betray you and take you to the vampire prince and see what happens. And so a lot of Urban Shadows is built to give people the opportunity to be their characters
Hmm.
in conflict and in concert with other characters, not as a party, but as an ensemble. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. So, what kind of stories are you telling then? Like, are there adventures, or are there kind of yeah? What do you get when you're playing it for the
Yeah,
first
like what
time?
what
Yeah,
happens, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. What
Yeah, yeah,
happens?
yeah.
What do you
Yes.
do?
Yeah, what do you do in this game? Yeah, no, I
Yeah.
feel like I joke because another game we published called Pasión de las Pasiones by Brandon
Hmm.
Leon Gambetta is a game about playing telenovelas, right? So you play
Love it.
you get
Yeah.
to yeah, right, exactly. It's adorable, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and like we were talking one day and we are both agreeing like it is so hard to tell people what you do in a game that's not about accomplishing anything. Right? Like,
Hmm.
what do you do in a telenovela? What do you
Yeah.
do? It's like, well, we fight with each other, but like that's an oversimplification, right?
Sure.
It's
Yeah.
instead like we bring the city to life, right? In Urban
Hmm.
Shadows, we see your different perspectives, and then the GM's job is to kind of bring those perspectives into conflict in interesting ways, and to
Hmm.
give the players something to do that that challenges them, that constantly
Sure.
throws curveballs at them. And you're like, well, why would that be fun? Like, why would I enjoy the GM like constantly messing with me, right? But the answer is because the GM is not an antagonist to you. The
Hmm.
GM is your biggest fan. They are
Hmm.
your number one. They want to see your character be as awesome as that character can be. And a big
Hmm.
part of making your character, and a lot of the tools that we give players when they make a character, is actually rooted in giving you something to do. Not
Hmm.
like in the sense of keeping you busy, but like
Sure.
writing stuff into your playbook that is actually interesting. So for the imp,
Hmm.
for example, the imp has a business to run, but they also have these schemes they're pulling, these ways they're trying to
Hmm.
get ahead. And so their schemes are always like blowing up on them, or like they get some opportunity to like pursue something. And so the GM's like, hey, that guy you were looking for to get you that
Hmm.
diamond you need for this ritual, like he's here in the bar. And so we see where that takes us. But above all, I think it's playing to find out what happens, meaning that we
Hmm.
don't have an adventure or a script, but instead the entire game kind of unspools from the character's choices. And
Okay.
it's really hard to describe because it's sort of like
Sure.
saying this adventure is about whether you all. It's not like what's a typical D&D adventure. You
Go kill
either
the
decide
dragon.
to yeah, like you either decide to kill the dragon or let the townspeople starve and die. And it's like, well, I guess I'm gonna kill the dragon. Like it's
Yeah.
not really a choice, right? But the
Hmm.
real choice here is like, hey, werewolf, when you get increasingly better offers to turn on this vampire that you don't like to begin with. Are you willing to do it? And then I, as the GM, know that whatever you choose, I'm going to follow it. It's going to go somewhere interesting, even up to the point that a character dies, right? And that you have to make a new character. But like the death itself will be a memorable, amazing part of our story.
Cool. So it's so much about, like you say, creating a living world where there's stuff happening and
Right.
just offering opportunities to the players for them to
Yes.
do stuff with it.
Yeah.
So I think you mentioned there's tools for generating your city at the beginning of the play. So, and is that new for the second edition, or is that been expanded a bit?
Yeah. So the first edition, we really used a lot of tools. At that point, like Apocalypse World was only like 5 years old, right? And we really
Yeah.
mimicked a lot of what was happening in Apocalypse World proper, which is sort of the
Mhm.
Mad Max role playing game. Like
Mhm.
you play weirdos who live in this post-apocalyptic hellscape, and like you're the gunslinger or the battle babe or the
Mhm.
brainer. Like you're weird and sexy and cool, and they have a lot of like, unsurprisingly, apocalyptic kind of stories, like where
Sure.
like Max takes these 5 women away and the entirety of the Australian desert is trying to kill him, like that kind of stuff. And
Yeah.
so the problem with this in Urban Shadows is that it resulted in a lot of like, this vampire is going to destroy the city, and then next week it would be like, this fairy is going to destroy the city, right? It was not really rooted in
Sure.
the day-to-day of how cities actually work, right? So
Mhm.
what we've done instead is built a system that allows the GM to have some lonely fun and to actually sort of what we call like declaim responsibility, right? It's like
Mhm.
like to give the game itself, the dice, the game, the engine, the choice, right? So,
Mhm.
for example, in a session I was running, the Oracle, who has a benefactor, every Oracle has a benefactor, played by my friend Kate, who's one of our staff members.
Mhm.
She was playing the Oracle married to this like fairy king, right? So
Okay.
she's this human woman. She's
Yeah.
married to this fairy king. He's like, they're really in love, like no, like
Yeah.
really love each other. But he's kind of this tragic, noble, like Beauty and the Beast kind of figure, right?
Okay.
And
Right. Yeah.
so like he ended up going to war with these demons, and I was like, well, cool, yeah, like Resplendent, her husband, like he's got a lot of resources, like he'll totally win this war against these demons. And so I go to the mechanics and I make some rolls, and he
Mhm.
just loses and loses and
Oh,
loses and
no.
loses. And so when I come back, I'm like, as the GM, like I would never have picked this, I would never do it, but it was so amazing to have Resplendent like come into her room and be like, I've lost everything, my queen, like what do I do, what next, like what, I only have so few options. And her knowing the future, that if Resplendent ever faces the demons that are attacking him himself, he'll die. And she's like trying to persuade him not to do it because she can see the future,
Yeah.
but he feels like he's trapped, right? And so like this is one of those moments
Mhm.
that like, so good, but I never would have done it because it just seems
Yeah.
mean, but that's what the dice said. And so we'll see where it goes. I'm playing to find out what happens too. And that's my favorite
Mhm.
part about running the game. And I hope you're getting that from running the games you're running, is like this
Yeah.
sense of like, I don't plan this shit. Like I'm not
Yeah.
planning out every beat. I'm right here with
Mhm.
you trying to figure out what's
Mhm.
going on as it happens.
Amazing. So I mean, we had somebody. So I put up this image that you've got here for Urban Shadow. So if people are listening and they're like, yeah, I want to get on the second edition. The backer kit is for kind of pre-orders is still open now. And we've had someone in the chat ask like, how much longer is this deal available? Because you've got a deal for like $74.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
it was really awesome. The project has been funded for a while, and some of
Mhm.
our delays have been because like this is my project, and I'm also the CEO here, and so like during
Mhm.
COVID, I had to like cover for people and this and that. And I actually got
Sure.
COVID
Sure. Oh
last
no.
month and like had like a
Oh.
month or two out. I'm okay, everything's okay, but
Okay. Good.
we're
Yeah.
we're often really slow. And so we're,
Mhm.
we're holding it open until we basically go to print. So I think it's
Mhm.
probably going to happen in the next couple months. Some of it
Okay.
depends on finalizing some things like some art. But we have been at this for a while, and we're
Mhm.
almost done. But I thought it was fun while we're here to say like, no, like you can actually like, there's still time.
Mhm.
Like if you want to join in, great. Our backers were extremely awesome, and they've been extremely
Mhm.
patient, and we've been able to do some really cool stuff. Like we have some special Urban Shadows dice. We have a cute little
Mhm.
dice set with the the
Mhm.
cityscape. We're doing this
Yeah.
really cool GM screen because I hate printing all the GM materials every time we're on the game, so I just have it all on my
Mhm.
screen. And like we're really really excited about Urban Shadows second edition. Like it's
Yeah.
in many ways it's felt like coming home because it was my first real game. Before that, we
Mm-hmm.
did like cool little indie 6x9 books or whatever. But like
Yeah.
this was the first time like I actually got really, really heavy into game design, and it's really cool to come back to it. Really excited to share it with everybody as soon as it's done.
Amazing. I know a lot of people are excited to get this on, which is why people asked me to have you on to come and talk about it.
That's awesome.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about kind of the new things in second edition. Are there any other kind of things you want to brag about or share about the second edition that we kind of haven't gone through yet?
Yeah. So I think one of the best parts for me is like, we promised these 2 new playbooks, and I was like, yeah, and we'll do the other playbooks too, like
Mm-hmm.
totally. But like we've ended up rewriting like half of them, right? Because
Oh, amazing.
I think like we looked at some of them, like the Spectre, for example, where you're playing a
Mm-hmm.
ghost, and we're like, okay, cool, yeah, you're a ghost, and that's fun, but like, wait a second, like these other playbooks are so rich now. Like, what am I doing with the ghost? So one of the very last changes we made before we kind of locked the mechanics and got down to like layout and writing was we
Mm-hmm.
actually gave the ghost like had anchors sometimes, but all the time we're like,
Mm-hmm.
every ghost has anchors. That's why you're here.
Sure.
Like you're
Yeah,
anchored
yeah.
to this reality. And we gave
Mm-hmm.
them this whole system of trauma where like when the
Okay.
ghost, yeah,
No,
you
I
can
love
tell what kind of
it.
ghost, yeah,
So,
yeah,
so then we gave the ghost trauma and like,
right,
okay,
yeah,
cool. All
exactly.
right, okay, I'm on board. I'm on
So
board.
the
Yep,
ghost
carry
has
on.
this trauma track, right? And when
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
the trauma track fills, like when you take damage or when something horrific happens, and
Mm-hmm.
when it fills, you have to do one of two things. You need to either commune with one of your anchors and like reconnect with who you are as a person, or you need to lash out with horrific violence. So,
Okay.
like now the ghost, instead of being just like, I'm a ghost, I'm gonna go around being a ghost, that's cool, which means that the player may or may not bring something interesting to it. We now
Mm-hmm.
have ghosts who are like, you're this weird fragmented person, right? Because you died. Like you're
Mm-hmm.
dead. You're not human anymore. You're like something other. And you have this cycle where like you're incredible. Like it's almost impossible to kill the ghost because they're already dead. Like,
Yeah,
what are you
yeah.
going to do to them, right? Like a wizard
Yeah.
could do it, but like a regular guy shooting a gun at you does nothing, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it does inflict trauma on you to have people do violence. And so we
Mm-hmm.
have these ghosts now that are on this cycle of like desperately trying to resolve whatever's going on in their lives, to investigate their past and like put it to
Yeah.
rest, because they're trapped and they actually feel trapped. And
Mm-hmm.
as you resolve those anchors, you mark them down as either resolved or destroyed / corrupted. And
Mm-hmm.
when you finish the last one, you get to choose what happens to the city based on how many you resolved and how many
Mm-hmm.
were corrupted and destroyed. And for every one you choose, like something good happens or something bad happens. And so like you as the ghost are really rooted to this city in a way that's really
Mm-hmm.
exciting and new.
That's really awesome. I love that for the ghost. Are there any other bits and pieces you want to brag about before we head off today?
Yeah,
Anything else for the second edition?
sure. The last thing I will say is like I feel eternally lucky and privileged to work with Marissa Kelly and Miguel
Mm-hmm.
Angel Espinosa, who do the art direction and layout for the book. Like
Mm-hmm.
you could see from just like the little ad piece we had there, like the layout is amazing. Like it
Yeah.
has this sort of like it has this sort of neon feel, like it feels like a
Mm.
city. But one of the
Yeah.
things that's actually gotten harder about doing urban fantasy is I live in a cyberpunk dystopia. So how do I write this and have it not be Shadowrun? Like what makes this not Shadowrun, right? Like I
Yeah,
played
yeah.
Shadowrun as a kid. What
Mm-hmm.
makes this still urban fantasy? And what I
Mm-hmm.
love about what Miguel and Marissa are doing is they always make it feel gritty and grounded and real, but still very modern. And I think it's a real
Yeah.
challenge with urban fantasy right now. When
Yeah,
you have a
definitely.
world where like you can have AI bots that chat with you on your phone, to have it still
Mm-hmm.
feel meaningful that there's a fairy that lives down the road, right? Like how do we have both of those things happening at the same time?
Awesome. And we just had a quick question. Someone asking, what's the difference between the regular and the deluxe core for the game?
Yeah. The regular book has the awesome cover that you saw there. The deluxe
Mm-hmm.
edition has some special black light ink that we're doing some cool things with for the faction
Ooh.
symbols and stuff. So it's like faux leather bound. The interiors are the same. Like we always want people to have the
Mm-hmm.
access to the same stuff inside. But
Yeah.
the deluxe cover has some special cool features for the cover itself.
It's a cool collectible version if you're a sucker
Yeah,
that sort of thing like I am. Like you can
exactly.
see some of the things
Yeah.
behind me. It's like, oh, I want the shiny one.
Yeah, exactly.
Fab. That's great, Jen. Thanks for
Yeah.
answering that. So one of the questions I ask everybody before they go is I ask them if they have any recommendations for any other tabletop role-playing games. And the rules are it can't be D&D because
Yeah.
we're not D&D,
Right,
and
right.
it can't be a game that you've made because we just spent, the last hour or so talking about your game.
Cool. So I realized, like, I was gonna say the name of this game, and I was like, oh wait, I actually have it here. I'm embarrassed because it's still in the shrink wrap, but like, there's a part of me that like doesn't want to open it because it's very
Okay.
special to me. But this is a copy of Voidheart Symphony, which is this
Okay.
amazing Powered by the Apocalypse game
Mm-hmm.
from UFO Press, who I believe have merged fully with Rowan Rook and Deckard.
Okay.
And Mina, who's the author of this, is for me like one of the most amazing PBTA designers. She's incredible. She's super interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Always has really different, exciting ideas. So in this game, which is another urban fantasy game, so if you're into urban fantasy, this is another one to check out. You
Yeah.
play like ordinary people who have access to this like other world called the castle, which
Okay.
sort of is warped and shaped by powerful like people, like bullies, monsters, predators. So like if there is, say, like a priest who's like abusing his power and like hurting children or something, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
when you go into the castle, like Dark Souls style, he's like actually like a giant monster, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so you have this one half of the game that's sort of about like being an ordinary person with bills to
Sure.
pay, and like
Yeah.
then you flip over to the castle side, your playbook totally changes, the mechanics totally change, and now you're a superhero on this other side. But that doesn't help you pay the bills on the regular
Sure.
ordinary people side. So
Yeah.
for me, this is one I have multiple copies. This is the one I keep in shrink wrap. I think it's an
Pretty one. Yeah.
incredibly cool game that if you haven't heard
Mm-hmm.
of, you should totally check out.
That's perfect. That's a great recommendation. Thank you so much. And Mark, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us all about Urban Shadows. We're all really excited for it to be coming out later this year. Where's the best place for people to stay in touch with you if they want to get kind of updates on new stuff that's going on
Yeah.
with either Urban, either with this game or with other games you do, of course.
Yeah. We mostly, send out notifications on our newsletter. So if you sign up at magpiegames.com for the
Mm-hmm.
newsletter, you'll stay up with everything that we're doing. You can also follow me on Twitter at Trumonz, Trumonz, and
Okay.
I'm available there. Although I don't post very much, I'm mostly busy making stuff. So
Yeah.
Magpie Games is usually the best place to get us. But yeah, like
Fab.
we send out a weekly newsletter or monthly
Mhm.
newsletter, trying to tell people what we're up to. And like you said, I'm really excited for Urban Shadows to come out this year. It will happen. I feel like a wizard. Like I will finish this ritual. It will occur. The book will be summoned.
Amazing. And we'll be very excited to see it as well. And if you are listening, again, you can back for the pre-order now. And the link will be in the show notes if you're listening, and it'll be in the chat if you're watching live as well. So on that note, I will say goodbye. Mark, thank you so much for coming on. To everyone watching and listening, thank you so much. Next week for Not D&D, it's actually our 1 year anniversary. So we are now 1 year old. So next week, if you tune in to listen, I'll be doing some flashbacks to some guests and some different things we'll be having to celebrate our 1 year anniversary of Not Dungeons and Dragons and celebrating indie tabletop role playing games. And that's all for this week. Mark, thanks once again, and thanks for listening, everybody. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.